Great. So here we are for part two for discussing political climate racism. And in this video, I will start with a personal experience from 2009. I was going to the UN Climate Summit for a protest. There were two buses going from the Netherlands to Copenhagen. And people were talking a lot about protesting for a fair and legally binding climate deal. So I was already expecting that colonial capitalist politics would stand in the way of any positive developments toward climate justice. But I must admit, I was still overwhelmed by the sheer force of police. There were 100,000 people on the street, which at that time was like the biggest for Europe, for climate. And over 1,800 people were arrested, and many of them were put in cages in a beer factory. Their only crime was thinking critically, collectively. At protest, I've seen police dogs were even attacking journalists, something we also see again and again at big summits. The policing of journalism, and also protest and direct action efforts to unite the critical voices from within the summit. And citizens on the streets were compromised by pre-arresting organizers the day before the action in which we would unite. And they confiscated bikes that were stationed in a squat for a bike block, and basically did everything to undermine our ability to raise resistance. They confiscated a sound wagon during the march. There was pepper spray, sticks, and riot police vans. There were like razzias in the bus looking for activists to pre-arrest sometimes. There's a really atmosphere of suppression, like being in a sci-fi movie. And they even had like police vans, like riot police vans with a scoop in front to push back crowds as they slowly advanced towards us. So clearly they did not want us to unite. The critical NGO voices, the critical Global South ambassadors, nations, and the indigenous delegates from inside the COP with the protesters outside. Remember, this was in 2009, so this was just after the financial crash, and really what was on the agenda was the end of capitalism. And this was much stronger in the advocacy than sometimes I see today. One of the demands that Bolivia wanted to put on the table was to have a world referendum about ending capitalism, the demand for reparations and paying climate debt by the rich or colonial countries, the demand for defunding military and transparency, and political recognition for water's life and that it could not be privatized, demands for legal rights for Mother Earth, and a tribunal needed to be erected to hold those responsible who commit ecocidal crimes against rivers and mountains. So all this political space of wholesome healing, of ecology and society was criminalized with state violence. So let's take a look at what political measures were allowed in this high UN body of international negotiation, and what we can learn from that. So one of the programs that was really front and center in protest was stopping REDD, REDD, and later REDD+. So This is an ongoing project by the UN. It has spanned over 60 countries with partners, and it does so in the name of conservation. Yet, indigenous peoples around the world have risen to say RDD plus indigenous peoples is genocide. And what it really does is create a market scheme in which people can pretend to cut emissions by doing some conservation, and doing that conservation in a way that pushes indigenous people off their lands. So this toxic idea of conservation, that nature can only be nature without people on it, and doesn't really look at what kind of people are on it with what kind of society measure. And then at the same time, rich countries get to pollute and pretend that somewhere else in the world they're doing something good. So it doesn't reduce pollution, and it does increase dispossession of indigenous people and their lands. A great place to learn more about this is no-red.com. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. I think basically we can say that REDD+ is saving colonial capitalism and destroying the web of life with colonized people as sacrifice zones. And while this may be horrifying and shocking, it is not new that environmentalism can be weaponized in politics against indigenous people. I will read here a bit about the founders of the national park system. The US government had promised land to newly emancipated Black citizens after the Civil War, but those properties were yanked away from them and from many Native American tribes to make room for new national parks and monuments. This was done at the behest of white men who are considered the first class of environmentalists, men like John Muir, Frederick Jackson Turner, and Madison Grant. They are called the fathers of conservation, the public park system, and the nation's hunting societies and forestry movements. Many were also leading proponents of much darker philosophies. So, in the case of Madison Grant, he wrote a book, The Passing of the Great Race, and Defending the Master Race. These were very much white supremacy books that were an inspiration to Hitler. It was the Bible to Hitler and Breivik, the man who massacred 77 people at the Norwegian youth camp in 2011. Other famous eco-fascists are the men who caused the Christchurch massacre and the men of the El Paso shooter. So this is also not something just in the past. This is something that is at its most violent in showing up in terrorism today. This eco-fascist thoughts, but it's also persistent in the politics of a project like RDD+. Again, I will provide links here for further learning. Back to the climate summit, because there are many people there. There are many different stories we tell about our demands, our goals. And I think it's a real shame that we haven't really learned from Copenhagen. I mean, the G77 walked out of the negotiation and really challenged the cooptation of this space by a few rich countries and secret meetings. And just, I don't know, it's really hard to fight asymmetrical battles, like battles against power, and that have all the money and the violence. But I think we need to be less cognitively dissonant from that reality of that violence. But fast forward to Paris, the moment of the Paris Accord, which was widely celebrated as a small step forward. And across the board, I encounter most people think that, yes, the UN has its problems, but it's our biggest hope and instrument for many to achieve international collaboration on environmental agreement. Yeah, that should direct our efforts. So remembering 2015, by now we're in COP21, 21 years of the same, still pollution in the world is going up. And yet we celebrate it for the first time in history. The whole world has made a public commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deal with the impacts of climate change. The Paris Agreement is a turning point for humanity. The wheel of climate action turns slowly, but in Paris, it has turned. So these are some of the headlines and sentiments also of some NGOs. While others have commented, one, that a lot of Paris was basically still Copenhagen dressed up, basically being a trade agreement, not an environmental agreement. Backing that up, you had UN ambassador from Bolivia, or former UN ambassador from Bolivia, Pablo Solon, who noted that this so-called climate accord was shaped more like a trade agreement. The word fossil fuel doesn't occur anywhere in the Paris Accord. The word finance, guess how many times we find the word finance in the document? That's right, it's not one, not two, not three, but 6 times. Also note that the proposals from the Cochabamba or Tiquipaya summit of 2010, with around 30,000 delegates led by indigenous peoples of the earth, had all been cut out. Like it isn't even really on the table. So even indigenous rights as a basic were cut out. It was reduced to a preamble of intentions with no legal binding language or articles whatsoever. And in general, we see that the conversation, even in our protest, is kind of stuck in a narrative of energy. Like we're supposed to fight just for 100% renewable energy, when really we need to talk about power and see, like, why is it that they can have secret meetings at Copenhagen and actually in Cancun present the US, can present a document that everybody just needs to sign, and have this lack of transparency when really already 29 million people a year are impacted by climate disasters and need emergency aid, and people are losing lives and livelihoods massively. And so also the climate summit had been named as the Copenhagen summit had been named as the accord on the table was one of climate genocide. And this is by African leaders of the G77 who also walked out of the negotiation on day 5. Summing up, indigenous rights were cut from Paris Accord. Why it concerns us all. It's a great article. What should I say about that? Let me look. Well, we need policy with eco-literacy and a system of knowledge and values that regenerates land bases, water, and community. And the best track record, the best chance we've got is a collaboration of indigenous-led measures. There is many efforts. It's just never really taken seriously. And what we see is a lot of tokenism. So Indigenous people are invited to the UN to speak their 5 minutes here, to be on this panel there, to take some photo ops, but they're not granted policy-making power. And so this in itself is a threat to our collective existence. Some more pictures of protests. So over the years, I have come to better understand the deep, deep divide between the environmentalism of the rich and the environmentalism of the majority of the world. So exemplifying that through pictures, the bottom posters mobilizing for climate marches are stuck in feel-good activism. And often I see they're also appropriating the visual language of revolution whilst maintaining comfort, a sense of white saviorism, like we're saving the planet or saving pandas, and a climate street party to abolish CO2, and giving this the hashtag climate justice, which is really an erosion of what the climate justice struggle should or does entail if we look at the other side of the divide. So in the activism exemplified in pictures above is radically different. There is a historical analysis of colonial climate crisis and the perpetrators that need to be held to account and pay reparations. So there's more people in their protesting in efforts for collective healing, and some of the demands that have gone into the chants we introduced with Climate Liberation Bloc were: what do we want? Fossil-free societies, an end of white supremacy, violence-free economies, a healthy world ecology. And we've seen this been taken up by other groups, which is good, because really what we're lacking is this demand for an end of white supremacy and violence-free economies. Also, in the picture in the middle, the importance of abolishing colonial racist borders that now pose another unjust barrier for refugees fleeing from either climate disasters and droughts, like farmers that can't work their lands anymore, or water or oil conflicts. There are many factors that are overlapping. So I'm going to wrap up this video with an example of Mozambique and political climate racism. So we know that Africa as a whole continent, a huge continent, only contributed 2% to global emissions that are now causing climate disruption. So just Shell as a company alone already emitted 2% of global emissions. So go figure. But yet they are Africa's most vulnerable to the climate disasters, both droughts and immediate disasters like storms. We've seen last year with Mozambique being hit by Cyclone Kenneth, and before that Cyclone Idai, basically destroying so much. There's so much loss, and in that loss we see it's just one episode of a loop of deprivation. So if we put it on a historical axis, first we see that it had been colonized by Portugal, and which stole land and traumatizes society. Now we get climate disasters that it didn't cause, which wrecks the land and traumatizes society. And then on top of that, we get IMF that profits of the impoverishment of land and society. So what happens is that there's these huge damages, and what has been fought for decades in the climate summits of the UN is that rich countries pay their climate debt. So they pay for not just the damages, but also the adaptation. But because we don't see that in politics, what happens is that then the IMF comes in and has to offer a loan to repair the damages. And so we see another debt trap for African countries that are most impacted and then have to pay their way out through debt. And to add to this example, right now Mozambique is also plagued with the curse of gas. There are seven oil and gas companies in Mozambique causing huge human rights violations. I will also add a link in the list about this. The fight is ongoing, but on top of dealing with all of this now, they're also dealing with the companies coming to get their gas. So closing this video, how does your climate activism build trust with people who are politically oppressed and erased? Another question to ponder about is, why do you think indigenous nations cannot fully participate in the UN? And what are your thoughts? Why are African countries still paying debt to Europe? We see, I recently read an article about the countries that have been colonized by France, and they're still paying every year. Like, African countries, on top of being looted, are still paying kind of reparations to Europe for losing their colonies. I can't wrap my brain around it. But why are African countries still paying debt to Europe? Love to hear your thoughts in our talk later. This was the second video.